we are occupied by other stories, stories that are not coming from previous generations and their lessons, but stories that are coming from Hollywood or politicians, and they're not being talked about. They're just being ingested without a process of discrimination or a process of conversation.
What if story is the answer to our crises of meaning and belonging, to our impulse to heal our lives and help others, to our desire and drive to leave this world better than we found it? Now, we love good stories. In fact, we're kind of obsessed, not just with the stories themselves, but with the stories behind the stories. Their oddly perfect timing, the healing process they provoke in their authors, and their capacity to catalyze individual and collective change. And we love exploring these with writers, thought leaders, entrepreneurs, healers, parents, and others. Tune in to hear these stories behind the stories and entertain with us the real possibility that whether you are a teller or a consumer, story is always offering or leading us to an answer. When Aaron and I sent our manuscript for A Religion of Story out to psychologists and spiritual leaders and educators, we weren't really sure how it was going to be received. We tackled some really big themes and we shared some really vulnerable stories. And as we began to hear from some of our initial readers, the parents and the grandparents even, we realized that it would be a good idea for us to host a few conversations that future readers could tune into as they begin to navigate this idea of a religion of story and all of the emotions that are likely to come up for them along the way. So today we got to hang out with two incredible people who we love. Karlyn Pleasance and Kate Herr are two psychologists who spend their days helping people rewrite painful stories and become the heroes of their lives. We got to talk to them about the powerful language of story and how it can be used by adults to heal traumas and bring those shattered and shadowy parts of ourselves back to wholeness. And also how parents and leaders can use it to help our children and those we serve avoid unnecessary suffering on their paths. So, go grab something delicious and come enjoy some sips of story and sanity with us. All right. Welcome to Sips of Story and Sanity, where we talk about the stories behind the stories with authors, speakers, thought leaders, healers, parents, and more. I have a very special little series that we're doing right now because Aaron and I are getting ready to launch A Religion of Story, a book that we have co-authored. And as we have been getting feedback from people, we have been realizing some things. Like we really need to do a little bit of conversing with people who also have a similar language of story and people who don't, so that we can have multiple perspectives that will support people as they go through the process of reading this book. Because one thing that we know is that we're getting really big reactions. So we want people to have places to go and listen to other people's big reactions to normalize them. So today I have invited two very special guests. Karlyn is part of the True to Intentions Saved by Story publishing team now, and has joined us. And I'm going to ask her to introduce herself. And then we have Katie Herr, who is one of my oldest friends. So I'd love for you two to introduce yourselves and share a little bit of why I asked you to be here today.
Okay, I can start. So my name is Karlyn. I'm a clinical psychologist. Started working on a book a few years ago, historical fiction that incorporates a lot of origin stories from several different perspectives, world perspectives, and got a little bit stuck. And along the way, miraculously got connected with Amanda, who's helped me put some order to it and get it close to being ready. And it's a story about a family's journey through illness and trauma and the inexplicable, and how stories and narratives and messages, what a central part that has played in the overall the whole story of all the characters. In my practice, I love working with story, helping people rewrite narratives, unpack thoughts, ideas, scripts that they didn't even possibly know that they had, rewrite new endings. I do a lot of parts work, which shows up a lot in stories. So I'm excited to be here and happy to talk a lot about narratives and stories and archetypes and how that plays a role in how people can get better.
And Kate?
Kate?
Yeah, my name's Kate. I am also a clinical psychologist. I also wrote the foreword to this book, so you'll have a lot more of an understanding how I'm connected to this bunch of hooligans in a really good way. The story is my language. It always has been. When I am trying to communicate, it's almost always through analogy, which is a picture story. Because I find it a lot more comprehensive and in-depth and can communicate a lot more than just straight words, so to speak. So, and definitely within my clinical work, my professional work, I do a lot of helping people rewrite some of the hardest, most traumatic parts of their story and change the way that they perceive themselves as a part of that story, not just being a victim, but moving on towards more empowered roles. So I'm excited to be a part of this conversation and see where it goes.
Yes, me too. And of course, we have Teddy here, and of course, the star of the show, Erin, who was the inspiration for this entire conversation. But before Erin was born, Kate and I met, and we joke in the foreword. I'm so glad that you shared that story. That our origin story, because this is what we're talking about today. Like, what are our origin stories? Ours should have told us how, like, the work that we would be doing as friends for the rest of our lives, right?
We did not get informed consent.
We did not. Well, maybe it was written on the piece of toilet paper and we didn't see it because it was dark. No, we were in Mexicali on a missions trip. Both of us were raised in the religion of Christianity, and we were both part of the same youth group. And we went down to Mexicali to serve and support in the ways that we could. And while we were walking to the baños one night, I realized I did not have what I needed. I was out of toilet paper. And so we always joke that we should have figured out that we were going to need a lot of toilet paper through our relationship, because it wasn't even like a year later, I don't think, that we were sorting out.
It has been the theme.
It's been the theme. Like, it has been a hot mess ever since then. It was glorious under the stars that night, right? And then ever since, it has just been kind of a shit show. Because what happened was we left our religious space that we were in.
A nice little shire.
It was a little shire, and it was so sweet, and it was very green and beautiful, and very, very well protected from the things, the evils in the world that we had only been told about. And then one day we left the shire and we went to
The land of the big people.
They were scary people. They were really smart people who asked me to read books that were just so much longer than I really think that first book they asked me to read was more pages than I had been asked to read in my entire high school career. And then they wanted me to have an educated discussion about it. And I was just like, what am I doing? I'm going to call my friend. She was a year behind me. in high school, but she was really well read. She spent a lot more time reading than I did. And so, you know, we started like sorting out these really big, scary questions, like, what if a whole bunch of the stuff that we were taught isn't true? Like, what does that mean? What what does it mean for and our beautiful little Shire got kind of torn apart, right? And so quickly we found story to be the thing that helped us to figure out how to talk to each other about the things that felt kind of unutterable, right? Like, it was much easier to say, I feel like Frodo today, than to try to talk about, to articulate the weight of like how scary this was.
Lost and confused doesn't quite ring a bell until you have a picture or an image of a character who was lost and confused, right?
Yes.
Then it's like, yes, I get it. Visceral.
Deep sunken eyes, you know, like kind of hunched over after a bit of the journey and having to be rescued by friends, like just said so much more. And I don't know about you, Kate, but I didn't get a lot of like, so what feeling are you feeling right now? When I was little, like language was, story was kind of my entryway into that. Was that true for you too?
Oh, I mean, I got the, you know, breathe through the pain conversation, and, you know, don't listen to your feelings. You want to be logical about things. So story, and then of course, choosing to go into the realm of psychology really opened up awareness and mindfulness of emotions that, you know, kind of kicked my butt, still do in a lot of ways. Yeah. But story gives me a way to at least process it a lot more quickly and efficiently than just trying to find a word to describe the feeling. I need a picture to describe the feeling. I need an image. And that's what story provides for me.
So I'm curious because I found out something really cool about you. Like, how did I know you for this long? And I didn't know this detail about your childhood, that when you were little, you had someone in your world who was all about stories with you. And
Yeah.
I was like, that is so cool, because my experience was very like, watch a TV show or movie by yourself, right? So my engagement with story was very isolated. And very like, I'm just going to make up what I'm going to make up from this because I don't have anyone to sort of sort through these elements with. But you had an entirely different experience. Can you share a little bit about that and what it meant?
Yeah. So I had this Uncle Bobby who he was probably in his late teens when this was happening, maybe early 20s. Whenever I go down and visit my grandmother, he would tell me superhero stories. Now, he was really into stories too. He loved comic books. He loved Star Trek. I mean, he was just a full-rounded geek. And he would spend hours just making up stories off the top of his head. And he created a superhero for me. So I was Princess Fate. And he would tell all these stories about how Princess Fate would, and you know, if my brother was there, he incorporated my brother, but I never remembered my brother's part because who would? It was me.
Supporting roles.
Right. But he would tell these stories about, you know, the challenges and the setting and then the villain. And, you know, when I was younger, he would tell me what Princess Fate would do to overcome these various challenges. But as I got older, we started to co-create the story. So he would create the scenario, and then I would have to jump in and say, well, I'm going to use this power, or I'm going to do this, you know, and then he would add additional challenges. Like, it's not just the bad guy you have to overcome. You have to remember that the bad guy often likes to go for the innocent people. So how are you going to keep the innocent people safe? Oh, you got to remember the bad guy is going to try and lie to you. So, you know, he would coach me in that as I got older and older. And when I say hours, like I think 3, 4, 5 hours sometimes at night, we would just go through
Wow.
story after story, and I'd say, give me another one, give me another one. And then by the time I was told to go to bed, because he was probably tired of talking, I would continue the stories in my head. So I got into this habit of daydreaming myself to sleep in superhero scenarios. And then, as I got older and Princess Fate started to feel not as applicable, I became a Star Trek geek instead. And so I was, some sort of Starfleet officer in Star Trek, doing all these fun adventures in adolescence. And I still do that kind of stuff today. I go to sleep daydreaming about different adventures, maybe not so classically heroic, but heroic for adult nonetheless. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I love that so much. And I know that, while I didn't hear a bunch of the stories that happened between you and Aaron, it wasn't very long into Aaron's childhood that we were already using the language of story with him.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious, Karlyn, how about you? What was your experience with story? I know you're like one of the most well-read not fiction readers I've met in a long time.
Well, growing up, the role of like feelings in my family system were that they were inconvenient and therefore to just be avoided at all costs. And I didn't have a lot of outlets. Like it took me a long time to find outlets to, do something or even understand that it would be okay to have feelings. So I read. I just dove into books and lived inside of books and kind of like you were saying, Kate, like I would kind of fantasize myself as a character in there and what I would be doing and which one would I be and why would I be that one? But do I really maybe want to be this other one? This kind of thing. And, now, not knowing then, but now being able to look back and understand that that was my way of like navigating what was happening in my world and having imagery and like a face. And a lot of the times, like I really loved books that had animals. It wasn't something that I was really aware of at the time, but when I look back, like, what are your favorite books? Like, oh, I liked Animal Farm and Charlotte's Web and Watership Down. I'm like, oh, these are all like animals. There's a metaphor in there, right? It's the it being able to be presented in a different image or something that was relatable in some way, but maybe not human. There was something in there for me that just made it have a little bit extra distance from what my experience was growing up. So that's kind of the thing I've always done. I get a little grumpy, kind of like hangry, when I have stretches of time where I don't have enough time to read things. Like it's the place for my brain to go that gives me I can digest and navigate and release
the enzymes. Enzymes to process. Yeah.
It's love it. So, of course, becoming a therapist, of course, and I have one sister. She's 2.5 years younger than me. She also became a therapist, and I think it's hysterical because people still to this day, that's kind of weird that both you and your sister became therapists. Like, nope, no, it is not. No, it's not weird at all. We needed a plate, we needed our own, and it's so funny because we're very, very different in our personalities, in our styles, kind of folks we work with, but boy, do we connect over books. And I think that was our, without even knowing it, it was our shared language growing up, is story and characters and, well, I like this one. Well, and she likes that one. And how come we didn't like the same one? And this kind of thing. It helped us navigate our relationship as well. Still does. So, love it.
Yeah. And then Teddy, I'd love for you to share your experience with story growing up, because it came from a more of an angle like mine. Right? What was your experience with story? Where did you get your stories?
My story was strictly Bible stories, and maybe whatever stories might have been told through illustrations, sermon illustrations. I didn't grow up with TV or, any of that. So I'm way behind in the story of a lot of the stories y'all talk about. But yeah, my stories were all biblical stories.
Yeah, I just think it's amazing how different people's experiences with stories when they're little are. And one of the things that you shared, Kate, in the foreword, which was so powerful, is this reminder that not too many generations ago, right? Story was a really important aspect of our culture. And it's arguable that it is today. Absolutely, but in a totally different way. So would you share a little bit about that and like the culture and the language of story and how you've seen it change?
Sure.
Studies.
So let's just put our imaginations on here and remember, before TV was there to help us, and before people were generally literate, what did you do after dark when it was cold outside and you weren't ready to go to bed? Well, I think we can easily argue and point to all tribes and families would come together around that fireplace and they would share stories. And those stories would be stories of tradition that had been handed down from one person or one generation to the next generation. And those stories would always include kind of the morals of the tribe or the culture. They would include the heroes, they would include the villains, they would include the victims and how those victims might have played out. It was just kind of commonplace. That's how the traditions were passed down. And you'd hear the story, not just once, but over and over and over again until you memorized it so that you could pass it down to your kid and thereby continuing the culture and customs and traditions of your tribe or family. We don't really do that anymore because we're not bored enough to do that anymore. We are occupied by other stories that are not coming from previous generations and their lessons, but stories that are coming from Hollywood or politicians or, other sources of media. And they're not being talked about. They're just being ingested without a process of discrimination or a process of conversation. And that's starting to become really sticky because those values are still coming in, but they're coming in unquestioned, unthoughtful. They're just sticking like bad calories without any nutrition. Pictures, images, they help.
It's like stale bread. Like, why'd you do that?
Empty calories, they stick. So, yeah.
I love that image, and it's so true that part of what got us started in this conversation around potentially writing a book was my realization of the impact that story had made on Aaron's worldview and the way that he was looking at things going down in the world around him. So, Aaron, would you share a little bit about some of those early conversations that we had that you remember around, like, should we write this book, and the conversations that led to me saying, like, I really think that we should talk about this? because I didn't even realize how important story was to your, how do I say it, like the clarity of your compass that you had developed and the way that you were looking at the world. So you share a little bit about that?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I don't remember the scene in the car very well with you. You tell that story a bit better. But if you mean about like that conversation around that happened after, we were talking about the book, started with, oh gosh, A Religion of Story would be the perfect title, but that seems a bit edgy. Maybe we shouldn't. Well, hold on, let's think about that, and then breaking that apart and then really figuring out that, all the nuances there with how everyone's got a religion of story and they're all different. Everyone's got their own and everyone's got a collective one and their role in it. And then we broke all of that down into themes that permeate, every single story of all time, pretty much. Maybe not all of them are in there, but for the most part, there's a kernel of them in everything. And so, going through each of the themes, we would definitely have conversations that were like, maybe we shouldn't put that in the book. Maybe we shouldn't say that about this person, or maybe we should keep it more, generalized and not get in the weeds of things. And eventually even working through our own stuff through the process, which is always this normal and it's fantastic. Everyone loves that. That's probably why Kate won't write a damn book, because she sees better. Everything that my mom's doing, right? She's like, I don't want to deal with it. Especially as a psychologist, she's like, I know what's gonna happen. She's got it all mapped out. So
see, you're smart.
Yeah. So
I'm learning by example, by watching other stories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she says that, but I have watched this woman use story, maybe not writing it, but she's still doing narrative therapy. Like at one point a few years ago, I walked into her bedroom and she had like one of those scary like detective map looking things, when you walk in and they're like trying to solve a murder. Like she was trying to get to the bottom of this thing that she could not see. And I walked in and I was like, oh my God, all of our favorite characters. And she had like the yarn and she was using story really intentionally to help her map her internal world. And, that's the same thing as writing a book. I mean, you're not getting out of this really hard, sticky work. You're just doing it a little bit differently.
Yeah, I guess I'm more of a kinesthetic learner as opposed to, a written word. But to the point, kind of what Mandy's describing is, I went through kind of a huge multiple level crisis a few years ago, family, identity, business, and it just like threw me for a whirlwind. And so I decided to engage in my own narrative, internal family systems therapy on myself. Now, for those of you who don't know what internal family systems is, you kind of want to imagine on the inside, you have this dining room table, and there are different parts of yourself that are sitting around that dining room table and interacting. Now, sometimes they interact like a healthy family system, and sometimes they interact like a dysfunctional family system.
Like a holiday. It's like a holiday event, right?
Yes. And when you find yourself in a lot of chaos and a lot of things are changing around you, that internal family system can start yelling and screaming at each other. And it creates all that confusion. It creates all that anger and anxiety and that feeling of stuckness. So what I did was made my insides outside on this wall and represented those different aspects of my internal family system by characters in stories, so that I could repiece it together and make sure I was hearing each part of myself better, and could also be the therapist at the same time, because it's hard to do therapy on yourself. You're really not supposed to do that, but I didn't want to pay anybody, so I just used my own skills. So yeah.
Okay, that reminds me, this happened just a couple of years ago. Have you guys seen the show Atypical on Netflix?
Yeah.
Oh my God. So Sam is like the main character, and he's at high school, right, Kate? High school. He has autism. I mean, higher functioning autism. He can go to school, but he definitely has all the spectrum stuff. And I think I was 2 episodes in. And I mean, I'm like crying, laughing, can't even breathe. I'm pausing and just like needing a minute. And my husband walks through and he's like, what are you watching? I'm like, I can't even talk about this right now. So I tell him really quick. He's like, well, what is so funny? I'm like, this is me. He's like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, this Sam, this is me. I cannot tell you how much I relate. This is like speaking my language. He goes, this high school boy with autism? I'm like, yep. And there was something about, I'm like, he thinks he's funny and nobody else thinks he's funny. I feel that way all the time. Like, and the awkwardness and thinking, like making like inappropriate comments and like having no idea why everyone thinks that's inappropriate. And like, this is me. This is in IFS. This is a big old part of me, is Sam from Atypical.
Yeah. And I think that's the really awesome part about story, is it can take a piece of you on the inside that is not as easily to define or grasp or hold on to, and it can project it outside into an external image that you can play with and see with a little bit better.
Yeah.
Right. That's one of the powerful things about the language of story. It allows you to do that. And you don't have to like marry that character forever. You can change and evolve and choose different characters.
Go through cycles. Like our favorite epic that we really bonded over was The Lord of the Rings, because it was unraveling at the time that we were unraveling. And I think you'd read the books, right? But I didn't have any experience with this at all. And we're like in the first movie, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, Kate, you're my Samwise. And she's like, yes, I am. Because that scene where Samwise like jumps in the water to follow Frodo, and then Frodo's like, but you can't swim. Like, that is what Kate did, following me into the honors program. Like, neither one of us really knew how to swim there.
But Mandy had the academics. She already had that acumen. I was like struggling to read and write and wasn't an honor student. And,
it was unbelievable, but it became our conversation. Like, the way that we talked to each other was through this particular, and over 20 years now, we will regularly receive texts from each other like, oh, this is an Aragorn moment. Like, oh my God, I am just like being asked to step into this level of leadership that I just don't want. Is it really my destiny? Who can I talk to about this? So like change my star map, because really don't know if this is the right thing. And then other times it'll be, who was the other one that got a lot of play?
Well, I mean, obviously there was the Gollum and Schmeagol got a lot of play. I got a lot of fun with Gimli. I really, felt like Gimli a lot when I'm trying to keep up with elves and men and running at long distances and good over short grounds, but not this long stuff, right? So we've also used analogies of like transitioning from Gandalf the Grey into Gandalf the White, and what did he have to do? Like, he had to fall into this chasm chasing a demon with a sword and die, so to speak. And that's not pleasant. But then he comes back and he still has to fight. Like, what the hell? We think like it's all over after you die. No one tells you might have to come back to finish a job. Sorry. No,
I love it. And so what's funny is like you have this experience where even Kate, had read these books a bunch of times before. And so she's watching the movies and she's being like, well, they're doing it pretty well, but also like there's these other parts. So she's kind of like informing me of these other details that are really important. But I'm literally like having this visceral experience. It's during a time where all these emotions are coming up. I have no connection to anyone but Kate. Like I've done a really good job of burning all of my bridges. And then Aaron shows up. It's like, what am I going to do? Like, I can't give him this religion that doesn't make
Didn't
sense
gamble
to
right now.
me. Right? It's just like, and I love how Kate said that in the forward, like, this is the moment where he joined the fellowship. Like, we were, it was like, sorry, kid. We're
You were
glad
popped
you're
out
here.
in the middle of Mordor.
You're coming up this volcano with us.
Yep. Yeah.
So, I mean, I just think about it too as like what it ended up doing was it ended up giving me a way of looking at stories, not just as something that would be reflective of my experience in the moment or an experience that I have had, but also prescriptive,
Instructive.
right? And instructive.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Like I remember that feeling watching Gandalf fall into the pit and just being like, oh no, like some part of me just knew, like, so those moments in the next few years where in my Gandalf moments, the you shall not pass, when I had to start like holding boundaries to protect my kid, right? Like these really big moments, I kind of intuitively knew that there were going to be these rather huge losses and little, identity deaths, let's call them, relationship deaths, that some of the fellowship were going to have to go on without me for a while, but they also were hopeful that way. Like, then he came back. Oh, thank God. The beginning of the next movie, I'm like, it's going to be okay. But like for a year, I was like, oh no, I don't know. Can I hold that boundary? Because I really don't want to fall into the pit. But it literally became this way of me. So then a few years later, we're sitting at the table trying to sort out, like, Aaron's trying to figure out why we don't have a Bible, which we did, but he didn't see it or engage with it. And I was like, I don't know. And then Ryan jumped in and said, oh, well, Avatar: The Last Airbender is our sacred text right now. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like all the pieces got put together. Like, now I can be a decent mom. Like, I don't have the energy to like get up and play and pick up his messes, but I can sit here and sort through story with him. I can ask good questions. I've been trained how to do that. And so, yeah, I love that piece of how that's been. And those, the story that I was asking Aaron about earlier was, and this was in 2018, 2019 that we started talking about this, right, Aaron? Like this.
I don't know, something like that. COVID.
Something like that. You were in a class that had to do something with
Human Spark.
Human Spark, right?
Yeah, that was like 2018, I think.
Okay. And your teacher had this conversation about the potential for immortality in your lifetime, right? Yep. Like,
yeah. She basically, like, if science keeps progressing at the rate it is, in an exponential increase, it's pretty possible by the time I'm 40, at least the human lifespan will be like 200 years or something like that. Or, possibly even further. Like, there's a good chance I, or at least my children, could live forever. And is that a good idea? Right? And that was the question it was kind of left with. And I think, you ask me every day at the end of my school days, you and Dad, how was your day? What did you learn? And I hated that, rolled my eyes, normal kid stuff. And, but I tell you, and I told you about that, and it was a little different. I was a little more interested in this thing, it wasn't like, the normal math stuff or whatever. It was, something that I had really been churning. And, I told you, and you were like, well, what would you do? If you were offered immortality, what would you do? I think that was your question, right? Would you take it? Would you live forever? There's an immediate no. And you were surprised. And I was like, you don't mess with time, you don't mess with nature, and there would be literally no purpose to my life anymore. It would be really hard to cultivate that for myself. Why would I want to? But if there's no end, then things become have less meaning. Making the most of your time, everything like that. So
right. And so I was like, probably most of the people listening to this podcast, just like, what? And then And then I was playing devil's advocate. Well, like, under what conditions would it be okay? You know, would it require you to like live in a certain part of the world, or for like the global situation to be in a particular, like, what would be the situation that would make it okay? And he was so emphatic, like, Mom, every story we have ever read and watched tells us don't mess with time, like death and, you know, having a finite end is important. And I was like, well, shoot, because we've never had like that conversation that way, but we'd watched a bunch of stories where he was figuring out that pattern. And so these patterns had like formed this moral compass that, you know, I was like trying to nudge it off the, like, well, what if that's like the big plan? Like, what if we're supposed to evolve to the point where we could have, you know, longer lifespans? They say they did in Bible times, you know. It was like, and he's just like, no. And so that's what got me curious about, like, wow, how far does this go? And then, you know, that was 2018. 2019 comes, 2020 is like the shit show of our lifetime. And all of a sudden we're having these other bigger conversations, and I'm listening to him watch the news and say things like, Mom, did you see that lady's face? She's such a villain. I'd be like, what? And he's like, that's a villain tell. Did you see that? And I'm like, no, record, like rewind it so I can see. And he's like, look at that grin. Like, that's like the, you know, the puppeteer in Pinocchio. Like, that's like that gross manipulation grin, like they're getting away with something. And I'm just like, what is happening here? So part of my reason for doing this whole project was like to figure out what had happened to his mind, because we'd been having great conversations, and I knew that it was a much better experience of engaging story and big themes, but I had no idea that it had like formed a compass for him in this way. So when we're talking about this, I kind of want to get back to this idea of the thoughtfulness around story versus the consumption. Because one of the things that we had a lot of conversations about when the global shit show took place was like, people are saying different things about this. Like, we're actually hearing different information. There are different stories being told about this situation. Like, who should we listen to? And so, you know, what happens when we lose our mindfulness around story and how to engage it? And then how can it be used? Because, you know, we have two psychologists here who understand the biology of story, right? Like, attunement happens through story. Like, story pushes all of those little buttons in us that make us like feel all of the things and listen and lean in and empathize and all the things that are needed for us to be really susceptible and suggestible, right? So I'd love for you to kind of share a little bit about whatever is coming up for you around that, because I feel like that's a really important piece of this.
Right off the top of my head, I think a lot of times when we throw ourselves into stories or we're listening to stories, we automatically assume we're in the hero position. We're on the good side, we're on the right side. And then a lot of judgments and a lot of interactions come from of course I'm the good guy, because we would never automatically identify ourselves as the bad guy or the villain. But of course, what we learn in story is most of the bad guys don't think they're bad. They've got a reason for why they're doing the things they're doing, and they think they're good. I mean, heck, we can talk about Putin right now. We look at him in the story of what's going on. He thinks he's doing good by Russia. The rest of the world seems to be thinking something different, right? And so being able to open yourself up to, okay, how would the narrative be different? How would my responses be different if I was actually the bad guy in this situation?
Well, I think what that reminds me of is it like the idea that there's always more to the story, right? There's always this backstory. So I recently watched Cruella.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so good. Cruella has historically been the villain. She's been the villain all the time in all the iterations of the Dalmatians and everything. But when you watch that movie, you're like,
Yep.
oh,
Yep. It's like Wicked when
That's how
the
she
Broadway
got
came
there.
out. Yeah.
that's how she got there. And all of a sudden there was this like little warm thing happening for Cruella, where you could understand why she was, doing what she was doing and thinking what she was thinking. And it's like you were saying, Kate, with the, IFS and part work, it's like we've got shadow parts and, messy parts and ugly parts in there, but they're all part of something. And there's a reason for them. Who is it? One of the guys that works in all the trauma research says that there's no bad parts.
Right.
There's no bad parts. There's parts that developed or were created for a reason. And usually that was around survival.
They have a function, a purpose.
Even if
in the
they
story.
are villainous or whatever, but it's, being able to tell stories about those parts too, and find your way to, hopefully find our way to having empathy and compassion for the parts that we do not want anyone else to see, but they're part of our story. And so that, what you just said reminded me of the Cruella, like just the most recent one that came up. I'm like, I adored her. Never liked her before.
Yeah.
I kind of do.
The fun thing is trying to figure out, okay, now you have empathy and compassion for, let's say, the darker parts, but how do you also engage them in a way that doesn't allow them to grow and overcome and become the main part?
Yeah.
Because the hero still has to develop strength. They still have to develop a sense of boundary, a sense of pushback, a sense of offense to temper their compassion, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that one of our favorite stories lately has been Yellowstone. And there's this one moment where I looked over at Aaron after a few episodes and I was like, who's your favorite character? This is one of our favorite questions that we ask all the time. And he was like, it's Beth, but I'm not sure I should love her as much as right? And he just like said the exact words that I was thinking, like, because there's something about her that was telling, it was like speaking to an underdeveloped part of me that is so concerned about taking care of everyone else and making sure everyone is happy and not rocking the boat, that I was just like ready to worship this lady who was so traumatized and so cruel because she had something that I didn't. She had like, I just need, and I was like, Aaron, I think it's because we're like really working hard on boundaries right now, you think? And he's like, yeah, I think that is what's happening right now, because we were both like really trying to sort out, like, how do we push back on some things? How do we, renegotiate some of these relationships that have gotten a little too soft, have gotten a little bit too wiggly.
And Beth was definitely the thing we should not do, for sure. That was a good bar to set,
Yeah, but I needed a little bit more of her. Like I needed that, like I didn't want it to come from a wounded space, like where I was gonna terrorize people.
It's like her shadow self was more dominant than the other part of herself. And I think the expression of her shadow self allowed our parts that didn't quite get there yet, but might get there if we didn't do our damn boundaries and draw them.
Yep.
And it created an acknowledgement of that, probably, and it let us know, like, okay, don't let that happen. But also, if you should be capable of that in a way that isn't that, you know what I mean? Like there's like a it's like archetypes, they can be taken good ways or bad ways, have negative or positive connotations, however you look at them, right? They're like, they have a shadow side and a good side. And sometimes you need to use the shadow side, even though it freaking sucks. And, it might hurt other people or something like that, right? Or, but it helps you be intentional about it too and aware of it, I think.
In psychology or mental health, we call those dialectical truths. Two truths that are seemingly opposites that actually come together to form a greater holistic truth. And there's actually a whole therapy that's based on this called dialectical behavioral therapy. And it's one of the most evidence-based effective treatments that we have for a lot of things. But as we're talking, it's fun to kind of think about, when you're watching something or reading something and you find yourself connecting to a character, make sure you also ask the question, what character are you disconnected from? Which character are you resenting? And hold those in tandem and see, what might you be learning from both of them together, right?
Yep. And I just recently we were watching Ted Lasso, and the first time we watched it twice in a very short amount of time because it's that good, right? But the first round through it, like, I'm in this process of, trying to sort out how to be a leader of a team. Like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. Like, I've seen a lot of really good examples of terrible leaders. Thank you. Like, very few examples of great ones that I want to like mimic, right? So in a way, I kind of feel like I'm making this up. But also, if I kind of pull out of that and look at all the stories, like, what are the threads of the really great leaders, right? And so Ted Lasso came along at this perfect time for me. And so the first time watching it, I'm like, oh my God, Ted, I want to be like Ted. Okay, that means I'm going to do a little bit more of this and a little bit less of that. Like, I was really like working it, right, while watching it. I was so relating to him. Oh my God, I loved him. Then Alyssa came and hung out with us and we watched Ted Lasso again. And I started to really connect with the villain. And I was just like, dang it. Like, that was so much. So I'm watching her, like, she's all about Ted, like, same thing as me, right? And I'm like kind of sliding deeper into my seat while I'm watching this, because I'm thinking like, oh man, that acknowledgement thing is for real. It is for real. And it could take me down so easily. And it could encourage me to take someone else down so easily. Like, I have been right there. And so, the first time it was about looking at Ted's blind spots. And the second time it was like, oh, heavens, I need to pay attention to this part of me that is like getting mad with this character. Because I'm seeing it more the second time through, because I knew what was coming, right? So,
Unfortunately, we can't do splits on the inside without doing harm to ourselves. We have to hold it together. And that's hard. You're constantly double fisting your insides.
Yeah. Without being like too aggressive. And that's the part that, like, when we're talking about story and creating that distance, that buffer, like, it's really easy for me to be critical of those characters and like, right? But if you ask me to look at that part of myself just straight out without having something outside of me to compare it to, I'd probably tell you to go screw off and leave me alone, because I don't want to talk about
yourself a lot of harm. All right. Because part of the inside work is you don't want to have a lot of judgment. You want to have kind of a benign curiosity on your insides. Otherwise, you're going to spark up a lot more shame and a lot more guilt. And then you're going to have to see a professional to help you sort that out, right? But if you can start to see these things on the outside and get some distance and perspective that doesn't throw you into self-shaming and self-hating or hating of others, but helps you hold it on the outside, it's kind of like, almost like a sand tray therapy, so to speak. I don't know how many of you are familiar with sand tray therapy, but it's a really great way we use it for kids, adolescents, and adults. Sometimes we use it in groups and sometimes even couples, but you give them this sand tray with a whole bunch of different figurines that they choose. And of course, in choosing, they're projecting parts of themselves and the figurines that they choose. And then they arrange it into the sand tray. And without them even knowing it, they're starting to create a narrative that describes the relationship between the figurines. And as you start to process that through that with them, their internal story starts to come out, but in a lot less judgment and a lot less shame, but in a still very powerful way. Story allows us to do that too.
And same, like the idea of externalizing it, right? This is the narrative therapy stuff too, is we take something and put it outside of ourselves and be able to look at it, hopefully find some compassion, Cruella, like, oh, I know why I do this or why I have this part, and then use the solid part of the self that you're in at that time to like have some discussion with this part and negotiate and navigate and like become friends and figure out how you're going to work together. It's the both and versus either or, same side, different sides of the same coin.
Yep.
And I think that that kind of integration and wholeness. I think I read a quote just a couple of days ago. I wrote it down here, like that Jung had talked about how myth and story cannot be separated, like from healing and therapy, and that he talked about like alcoholism, addiction, and different kinds of compulsive kind of acting out type behaviors are basically spiritual thirst for a sense of wholeness. Right? There's somebody trying to fill something or a spot or hide something, something that just has not been integrated or brought into the whole. But the shame stuff that you mentioned, Kate, I mean, that's the thing that gets in the way so often.
Well, and I mean, and this is something I say a lot in therapy too. It's really hard to problem solve or work with invisible things. And that's a lot of what emotions are. I mean, emotions are this really cool thing where it's bridging our invisible parts with our physical parts, because we can feel emotions in our body, but they also are connected to something ethereal, something more. But they're still freaking invisible until you find a way to represent them outside in a tangible way. For some people, it's good enough to find words on a piece of paper. For some people, they need even more, and that's where images come to mind for me, or analogies, or stories, or characters, because it enriches the invisible into a visible and tangible way to play with it, so to speak.
Yeah. Okay. So here's what I'm feeling. I'm feeling like a whole bunch of these people who are listening are going to be like, really like, whoa, like,
hey, are you doing okay? You hanging on there?
Like, let me just sort out like my story stuff. But one of the things that's really important to me,
keep your eyes on the road. Sorry. Keep going.
is to keep your eyes on the road. Yes. And also, this brings up two things for me. One is that, and I know that this is what this book is going to do. It's designed to do this. It's designed to ask the adult to say, what is my religion of story? What do I actually believe about how to interact with the unknown? Not what I say I believe. Oh, well, when the unknown happens, blah, blah, blah. No. When you are in the middle of it, what do you actually believe? How are you actually responding to what is happening, right? Like training, what do you think that power dynamic should be between you and the mentor? Not what you think it should be, but when you're in the middle of a training experiment, what is your actual posture with the authority figure? And does that affect the way the training goes down and how much you can actually take from the experience? Okay, so like the whole conversation, the whole book is designed to really push at the adult to say, look at your own religion of story and sort it out. Like really question the assumptions, really, because a lot of it is probably like right on. But there might be some points where you're just like, oh shoot, like I haven't really been able to get the camaraderie thing right in my entire life. Friendships have always been like a freaking nightmare for me, right? And so I really want to like dive into this theme and ask questions and use story to help me. Okay, so I want that to be like, yes, if you're feeling that way about this conversation, I am so glad. And also I want to like take a breath now and bring it back to the kids, because one of the reasons why we designed the quest was to give, and we're going to do a religion of story workshop series. Erin and I are going to co-facilitate it, to give adults the space that they need to sort themselves out. Because unless you have a really good mindfulness practice, it is really hard to do this work and be a good ally and guide for your kid on the couch. Like, I had to have a lot of mindfulness to be like, I'm not going to respond this out loud yet because he's only 6. I'm going to turn this into a question. So what do you think this character could be doing right now? You know, instead of like, that mother, blah, blah, you know, like how I was feeling, I had to like shapeshift that for him, right? And then go sort myself out when he went to bed. That's how we did it. So there's that caveat. But when we're talking about hanging out with the kids and watching movies and using stories and books to really look at character development of our children. And we also say, you know, at the subtitles also, cultivating character and preserving freedom. There's a sense of like agency that Aaron has because I asked him questions. I never gave him answers. I was always asking him to look at the patterns and the themes and to extract what he could from there. And sometimes I'd be like, I'm not sure about that. But instead of saying, well, I think this, I'd be like, well, what about that other example that we watched where that character made that choice? Why do you think that these two, like, what do you think was the difference, right? And sometimes, honestly, it was just to help myself sort it out, not him. Like, I was really having that question. So when we're talking about this process of using it with our kids, what is some of the, I don't know, the principles, the questions to ask, the little guideposts, excuse me, that parents should keep in mind?
Don't feel like you're in a hurry. You can think about the response. You can come back to the conversation. You don't have to do it right then, right there, and have it right, right? Let yourself off the hook of that pressure. Allow yourself to think about it first.
You know, I totally agree with that. And one of the earliest like clinical lessons I learned, did not learn this in school, no textbooks, but when I'm in a room with clients and not knowing what I'm doing, my supervisor said, it's totally okay to say that you don't know. Like, so you'd have, you know, all these clients were like, Karlyn, what should I do? What do you think this means? And like, don't make up an answer. It's like, if you don't know, you don't know. You can say, I don't know. What do you think? Or maybe we can like talk about this together later and see if we can come up with something that seems to make sense. But so I think that slowing down and being able to like, which I think is self-work, I think for parents, the adults, is like being okay, like you're not going to know sometimes. You're not like always going to feel like you're the expert or have all the answers or have just the perfect thing to say to guide or help. But like, I remember, and I don't know, Kate, if this was your experience, but I remember feeling so scared back then of like, but isn't that why I'm here? Like, I'm supposed to be this person helping and guiding, and what are they going to think of me if I'm this new facilitator and I'm like, I don't know. But that's not ever what happened. No. I never had an experience with a client, whether they were a young, you know, kid, an adolescent, older, never, where they were like, what do you mean you don't know? Usually it was like, oh.
I got a lot more respect from even the adolescents when I said, I don't know, let's think about it together.
Well, and then you're giving them the tools to figure that stuff out later when they don't necessarily need you anymore. Like, right? Like, then they're actually prepared to deal with whatever it is that shows up. And that's kind of the big thing here with, you know, using the story as like a dummy to figure this stuff out. And then when you actually face it, then you have something to reference and you know how to think through the patterns because they're patterns. You have something so similar that you can just, take it from there, and it's easier. Hopefully, that's the hope.
I think, my experience is a lot of parents get freaked out. Like they feel this urgency and this importance that they need to respond right now. And if they mess it up, their kid is going to be messed up for life. And so they need to lead, and they need to lead strongly, and they need to lead no doubt, because that's what a good leader is. But that might be the narrative story that needs to be changed. Right there.
Totally.
In our clinical work, we learn that it's not about the leading, it's actually about the being present in the ambiguity and not forcing the moment out of that uncomfortable space, but just demonstrating that it's okay to be in that uncomfortable space and to explore it. That is a lot more containing and educating than trying to push yourself out of that moment and get your kid out of that.
And that makes me curious, Erin, a question for you. All these, years really of your mom saying, well, what do you think about that? Or why do you think he just did that? Or would you do that? What would you, whatever. How was that for you to be, again, clinically, this shows up in people saying, you let the client be the expert. You're not the expert. You're there to sit and hold and ask questions, but they are the expert. Your mom wasn't telling you what to do, how to think, but you almost being elevated, right, as the child.
Well, yeah, in the moment, I thought it was bullshit, in the moment, and rolled my eyes and stuff. But
that should be in the book, by the way. I think it is, actually.
It probably is. It's got to be somewhere in there. But I didn't feel anything in the moment in terms of, I think earlier on I didn't think much of it, but as I got older and I'm getting older, I actually really valued having that deep type of conversation. And I think that openness created it created openness, and so a space to be able to have a dialogue through that kind of language later on, when it wasn't a movie or a TV show. Some crap actually just happened that I need to sort out in real life. Okay. And we need to sit down and talk about it, and I can have some answers rather than looking for her. She never gives me answers when it comes to that stuff. Usually you can see her. It's funny. And actually I do this too. You go into a mode, and maybe as the facilitators and psychologists asking these questions, there's a mode of being that you kind of switch on to a space of more listening and less giving the answers, and it just happens. It's just this natural thing. And I can see, I know when you look, you have a face when you do it, Mom, by the way, you do. And I go, and maybe I turn a little bit inside when you do it, but it always turns out great. And I try to embody that for sure.
Yeah.
For other people.
It's a big debate though. In the beginning, so I really felt I literally abandoning my religion at the time, right? Trying to keep his mind and his heart clear from narrative that was this is the truth, right? The way that it was being told, until he could sort through it. And then at that point I was yeah, talk to him. When he starts asking you questions about it, tell him what you believe. It's cool. And so, but the approach, even between Ryan and I, he would get I don't know if you're doing this right. He'd be I'm not sure that you should be elevating him. You use that term. We've actually had discussions between him and I and a few other people that would have this parent and child, there's a healthy hierarchy, right? There's a healthy thing that you got to figure out. But then at what point, is that just when safety is taken care of? Okay, so, I know what's best in these things because I have some experience. Don't run out into the street. Don't touch the hot stove, blah, blah, blah. Right. But at what point do you start treating this human being like a human being and let them tell you what they think? Because I mean, I had some very strong opinions when I was 2 and 3. I remember them. Did anyone ask me? No. When I tried to share them, how was that received? Not great. You know, like when we're talking about all of the big trauma stories that I witnessed in my business, like it kind of all comes down to those early years of trying to express something or understand something and not being treated with a sense of equality and curiosity and empathy, right? And it's understandable because by the time, you know, he was born, I was literally a paralyzed mess. Like my physical body was paralyzed with bent up emotion. And so, you know, the only thing that kept me from doing the same thing that had been done with me was story and a little bit of child development, like be curious. It's better to just be curious. So I love that advice of like slow down, because that's also something, you know, I've heard from a few readers of like, oh, you always have the right question. Well, yeah, you guys saw 7 scenes, right? Like there were a lot of times where I messed that up and I had to recover and come back. Like, oh, maybe this wasn't the right story at this time. Oh, maybe, you know? Or I had my really, you know, as he got older and I started to like really be expressive and working through my own stuff, he'd be like, what's up for you right now? Like, you know? And so like understanding too, that when you bring that, I think I said it a few times in the book too, like understand the implications of this. If you actually ask your child what they think, then they're going to tell you what they think.
It's empowering.
Be ready for that. And it's confronting because I tried to create a space where he would feel comfortable being like, well, you're acting just like Beth right now. That was ugly and unnecessary. Oh, right? Like, you're right. That was kind of ugly what I just did there. So, you know, it's that next level of opening. I want parents to understand, like, yes, this is going to cultivate character and preserve agency. And also it is going to invite you to your own next level.
It's not going to be clean. It's going to be messy.
Super messy.
Yeah.
But it's better than the alternative.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I love, you know, we talked about like this idea of like wanting to have the answers and like that posture. You're like, I need to be the expert. I need to know what I'm doing. And, you know, I was so happy when I finally heard another adult say to a group of young people, to Aaron's graduating class or the class that came before him, like, here's the big secret. The adults actually don't know what they're doing. Like, we are also making this up. I was like, what does that do for, you know, what does that do for a child to have a parent? Because again, another major criticism, like, why would you tell your kid that you did that? Why would you expose that mess to your kid? Well, you know, I thought it was age appropriate. Most of the time it was, but why would you do that? You're afraid of losing respect. I'd be like, no, because I know he's going to face something like this today and he can learn, you know, today from my hot mess, then maybe he'll do it better when he gets there, when he confronts the same situation. So I don't know.
It takes humility to be a good teacher, right? And not a bully in teaching.
And to be able to tolerate, right? Tolerate not being confronted. or being told, I don't agree with you, or I don't think that's right, mom, or whatever the thing is. Like there is something about that emotional tolerance, which I think would be, back to your question, Amanda, about like, you know, some of the advice for parents, like it's gonna look messy, and like, what do you need in terms of support or help or allies to like tolerate the parts that are going to feel really uncomfortable, because it'll slam up against your own narratives and history and what you think you're supposed to be doing as a parent, judgments from other people, blah, blah, blah. It's a lot of work.
Yeah. And really, you know, thinking about like what are the stories that we choose? What are the stories that we allow? You know, we had to have big conversations about that. Like I remember Kate being like, so what are you guys watching now? And I was like, Game of Thrones. And she was like, whoa, you're watching that with your 16-year-old son. Like
A lot of scenes were skipped.
right? Like, how's that going? Well, we made agreements about what we were going to do during certain scenes that were like incredibly uncomfortable. But also, you know, just because I'm super uncomfortable with violence and a whole lot of skin doesn't mean that it's not something that he's going to confront as a young man. So how do I stay grounded and honest about how I'm feeling and sort out at 16 years old? Wow, like I have so many hangups about this stuff. This must be because of, you know, like really having that open dialogue and allowing him to not have this be like, we were talking about those dark shadow parts, right? Like this is something that we don't engage in our family. Like we don't, and we've had big disagreements here about what should be on screen and what shouldn't. And I was just always the one who was like, I don't know. I'd rather be having this first conversation with him. I mean, I'm not really. It's not comfortable. I don't know if I'm doing it right. But I don't really want him to ever feel like he's going to have to engage something completely outside of the frame that was okay for me to engage. Like, I need him to see me uncomfortable and still willing to sit there and sort it out. And
it has me kind of thinking of, okay, we all want to protect our kids, and inherently we usually don't question, why do we want to protect our kids and from what are we trying to protect them? And that's a very mindful question you have to go into. Okay, you don't want your kid to see these scenes in this particular movie or film. Okay, what specifically are you trying to protect them from? Can you actually protect them from it? I mean, you might be able to keep them from seeing it on the screen, but is that going to protect them from engaging with it in real life? No. So maybe instead of trying to protect them from it on the screen, you walk them through it on the screen in preparation for real life. And of course, that's all based on some age-appropriate concepts, but that sounds a lot about what you did with Aaron. Let's engage these hard parts.
Yeah. And he could tell, like little kids know, right? They like know, Mom, what is up with your face? And I think that I fixed my face. And he's like, no, there is something going on there. And I, you know, like, oh my God, I'm so uncomfortable with this. Why? Well, I don't know. Like he also learned how to sit in the I don't know with me. Like, I don't have the answers and I'm sorting it out. And how did you sort that out? Because maybe it'll help me right now. You know, like, how'd you get there that fast? You know? So, and it does, like that protection conversation, so much of it, when I would ask that, like, what am I trying to protect him from? It was really not trying to protect him. It was trying to protect me from being uncomfortable and having to be honest that I didn't know. I didn't have any answers, that I'm, you know, shoot, the story, even in business now, you know, he's out here like ready to take over the world and in and all of this business and system architecture and stuff that I don't, and I'm just like, I got nothing. And he's like, okay with it. You know, you've been running a business for 15 years without these things. Yep. That's kind of not great, Mom. Yeah, I know. Want to help me out with it? But I think that we can have those conversations because we've had those really uncomfortable ones. So
see, I didn't say that. I just go, ooh.
Yeah.
But I basically say that.
Yeah, you basically.
Essentially.
Yeah, like, oh my, really? Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, really. Not even this? No. Oh, okay. Well, I am so grateful to you. Teddy, I want to hear a little bit about what your experience is because you've been kind of quiet. I want to hear your voice. And
He wants to make me cry. I'm sitting here in a previous podcast about this. I, half jokingly, said I wanted to grow up to be like Aaron. Like I felt like he just had something, this compass. I mean, I was given a moral compass, like scripture, that type of thing, which you can like accept or reject, along the way at different parts, and sometimes reject when it's not wise because, it's some kind of external something that's trying to control you. And, he has something inside that just comes right to the crux of the matter. And I was a little jealous of that. And as I was sitting here listening to the experts and realizing that I came into Amanda's world 11 years ago this month. And I have been hearing the language that you're using. She's been putting me through the paces you're talking about. And that we weren't watching movies. She was sitting on the couch with me, watching my story and asking those questions, refusing to give me any answers, but just asking those questions. And I realized that she taught me how to parent myself. Using the religion of my story. And I just think this is so powerful. It's really powerful. The book is, it just blew me away. It opened me up in so many powerful ways that like I could only handle little bits of what it would open up because it was just like way overwhelming. And I'm going, oh, I'm gonna have to go back and read this again after I process this little bit. And I recommend the book, whether you're a parent or not, but for parents. And this religion of story coming from a pastor's kid, a pastor, that title freaked me out. that was as far as I got, the title. And I'm like, but it really is. It is we have a belief system by which we operate, and it's been unintentional. It's come upon us through story, through our experience, whatever, and we are living according to a religion of story. We are, and to get intentional about that and to rewrite those stories. But anyway, I'm just really, as I said here, my whole point is that I am been sitting here trying to hold back tears, watching my face on the screen, trying to see if it could tell that I was crying. But the power of this, and the power of what you do, Amanda. Like, it just never gets old with me, because I honestly, God, don't know where I'd be today if I had not met Amanda right when I met her. Like, she came into the storyline of my life when I had walked away from my religion. That was all I knew. So I lost all my mentors, lost anybody that could speak into my life. I didn't trust anybody, because I felt like I had been lied to and fed a bunch of stuff that had turned me into something I didn't want to be. And it was just this huge thing. And God put her in the storyline of my life to teach me how to do what Aaron has learned to do, which when I read the leadership chapter, like, I sobbed and sobbed and sobbed, because that's what I didn't have. He had that. I didn't have that. And I realized sitting here, like, that's one of the things that Miss Amanda has put into my life, not by telling me anything, not by answering my questions, but by sitting with me in the story of my life and asking those questions, that I have become a leader in my own life. And I don't have words. I'm thankful.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for letting me be your ally. It's been
Teddy, I think you really capture what the process feels like for everybody. That exactly is what it is. And there's no shame in tears. Right? Don't hold them back.
Yeah, I think I might have said this in one of our previous conversations, but in terms of this book, I think this, like, therapists should read this book, especially if you're working with kids or adolescents. I mean, anybody really, but kids and adolescents, because they're just still more in those critical periods and formative years, to learn kind of that Socratic method of constantly turning it back over. Well, what do you think? What do you think about that? What would you do? I think it has such a place, like, on the therapy bookshelf.
Yeah, that's what
especially if the people that they're working with are not getting this at home.
Right. Yeah. And what are the ways, like, I know, Kate teases that I try to get her to write books. And I think that it's an internalized voice now. Like, I think I said it a few times, but
2000.
but also this idea, like, you both have shared about using story in therapeutic settings, and like how this gives like a way for families to connect, right? Like, it's a structure for, like, and it's okay to not know exactly what you're doing. Like, you're just watching and being entertained and asking a few questions, and one question, one answer, one eye roll, one connection at a time, your child is getting the experience of you being curious in who they are and what they're thinking and how they're feeling. And it doesn't have to be, those scenes that you saw, a lot of those were like compilation scenes, like we would watch a Nemo like a bunch of times, and you saw like 7 movie watches in one scene, right? Like, he would only be able to handle like one question at 3 years old, right? But then it would be the next question and the next question. And so it's just the effort, right? That's the effort to get to know them. So, all right. Any final tidbits of offerings to the listeners, the people who are like feeling a little bit like Teddy, overwhelmed by the opportunity, really?
I think, Teddy, what you shared, and I've heard you share in different ways, including your chapter in you can't make this story up book, is how, well, one, I mean, for me, how common it is that many people did not get this in their upbringing and their childhood. And then we grow up and we find ourselves, you know, struggling later on. And almost like what another member said a couple weeks ago about like, where were you when I was like 12, Amanda? Like, what happened? But it, like, the idea that we can find the people, like there's people out there who speak this language and are available and want to be allies, and in turn, like you having become a kind of a leader of yourself, of your own life, you offer that to other people too, whether or not you think about it like that, it's, you offer that. So you're offering to other people a lot of what you've received, which, I don't know, to me, it just reminds me of what you shared earlier, Kate, about stories, right? This is passed down, you pass it down, you pay it forward, and people will receive, and hopefully they'll receive it enough that then they're going to give it to the next person, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
It sounds almost counterintuitive, but relax into the process. The more you try and squeeze your butt cheeks and like defend against it, the harder the story is going to hit you, right? So take a few breaths, relax your butt cheeks, let the story impact you without judgment. The emotions that you're going to experience, I promise they're not going to kill you. They only make you think you're going to die, but you're not actually going to die, right? And it's really important to remember that difference. And then make sure you are talking about it to somebody else, that you're not just doing it all inside your head, because if you're doing it all inside your head and you're not getting it out, bad things can start to happen very quickly and you can start to lose your way. So make sure you are talking about it.
Very much.
In the words of the great Ted Lasso, be curious, not judgmental.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, good.
All right. That's a perfect spot. So thank you, thank you for this conversation today, for bringing your expertise and your love of story and your everyone's common love for Erin to this space. Thank you. I want to thank all of our listeners for hanging out with us. I hope that this supports you. I hope that you will check out all the other resources that are being offered to help people through this process of unpacking a religion of story and sorting it out and crafting a healthier story for you and your children and generations to come.
Live long and prosper.
Yes.